Welcome, everybody, to the HIP 51 to 53 panel. This panel is a follow-up to a Twitter space that we did last week, where we had some ecosystem partners explain how they're interacting with this new architecture, this new vision for the Helium ecosystem. And we also explained what HIP 51 through 53 are. And up here today, we have some of the authors of HIP 51, including James and Tushar and Abhay's on there. So that's hashcode for anyone who doesn't know. I want to use this time as efficiently as possible. Since we have the authors up here, I want to get as many community questions in as possible. If you want a recap on what HIP 51 is, I'm going to refer you to that previous Twitter space. So that Twitter space is on the official Helium account at Helium. And in that, I give an intro. I read aloud the intro to HIP 51 from the actual HIP itself, and I also gave my own summary. And we sort of went over some of the subDAOs that are proposed in addition to the ones that you are all familiar with, which are LoRaWAN and 5G or cellular. Before we get into questions, I'd like to invite anybody on this panel to give an update on what the latest status of these HIPs is in your own words, and what should we be looking out for as we're looking at the latest revisions of these proposals? What is being iterated on? What are the changes?
I'm happy to chime in here. So I think HIP 51, as shared on GitHub, is basically final from a words perspective. Real HIPs have code, so I can't say it's ready for a formal vote as a full HIP. But I can say that, I think the ideas are all there. I also think HIP 52, the ideas are all there for the LoRaWAN subDAO. Expecting a full new draft of HIP 53, which will be the 5G or the mobile subDAO, to be updated this week, potentially today, otherwise tomorrow. And that will be a substantial update from what's currently on GitHub. So, this has been a month-long process, the work along the way. Community's been able to see the work in progress and comment on it along the way. And, I especially want to thank all the community members who provided suggestions. That has been really helpful. And I think, we're finally here. All of the pieces kind of work together and they're cohesive from a vision and design perspective, in my opinion.
Great. Yes, this has been a long process for sure. I don't even know how many months the channels have been open at this point. And we're up to HIP 60 even, and we are still working on the 50s and even some of the 40s. But yes, things are looking much better. All right, so in the interest of using time as efficiently as possible, I'd like to get to some of the questions, since this is an AMA that were submitted through the form. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions. We picked what we thought were the best questions, and I'll be asking those to the panel right now. So the first question is, will these HIPs be built on the current network, or do you plan on using something else? If it is something else, what will you use?
I guess I can take a shot at trying to answer that. I think to start with, we've got to do it a little bit in phases. There's discussion about, what the right, the HIPs sort of contemplate using a high-speed L1, and, there's some discussion about what that should be and how that should work. I think from my point of view, the concern would be that if we try and make the first step too big, it will be very, very difficult for us to ever get started. So I think what's likely to happen is that we would do a version of an implementation using the current chain, and in parallel start to evaluate other options. So some people have suggested, for example, using Cosmos, and some people have suggested Solana, and there's some good discussion in the HIP channels about what to use. But I think there needs to be an easier way for us to get started, because aside from the work of actually implementing the smart contracts or the code on the L1, there's the whole migration process, right? And that alone might be quite complicated, because you've got to get exchanges to move, you've got to figure out wallet compatibility, you've got to figure out what to do with validators and their staking. There's a lot of migration questions that are sort of logistics separate from the actual code that has to be built. So I think at least what I'm advocating for is to just start with a way to sort of implement the simplest version of what HIP 51 tries to do, with the programmatic treasuries, and implement the protocol score and implement the new token types, but do that on our current chain and then look to migrate over to something else, whatever that something else may be, as a second set of steps.
Yeah, and to add to that, we're starting to, as a core dev team, we're starting to understand what that looks like, what pieces we want to take first. And my goal is that we actually create like a separate fishbowl channel that allows people to see that work, and sort of tie any PRs you might see, or any like draft forks, or sorry, not forks, but branches that you might see on GitHub to like the actual work that's being done there. So coming soon as we sort of try to understand what the pieces are we want to build first.
All right, great. The next question is, how would one describe these HIPs without using the language of crypto or finance? Is there a real world analog?
That's an interesting question. I'll take a stab at that, and then hand it off to anyone else who wants to. I would say that the way I would describe this HIP from a traditional business perspective is that previously Helium was a company with a specific product. And this turns Helium into a conglomerate that has multiple divisions underneath it. And those multiple divisions can specialize to deliver products that are differentiated from each other.
Yeah, I would generally agree that it's sort of like if you thought about a traditional company, whether it's conglomerate, it's a bit of a dirty word these days, but like you wouldn't have the same team working on every single project necessarily. You would have a project manager, you would have a design team, you'd have a dev team, you'd have a marketing team, and this cross-functional team, would sort of work on this specific sort of macro project. So if you think about Google, you might have, the traditional ad business as one team. You might have Gmail as another team, Project X as another team. And it allows for these teams to sort of hyper-focus on that project at hand rather than sort of splitting that bandwidth towards everything.
And of course, this is all being done in a decentralized way. So a lot, kind of less like a company, more like a DAO.
They said no crypto phrases.
Oh my God, you're right. I'm too deep in it. All right, I think that was answered well. Why would new network operators set up their network as a Helium subDAO when they could set up their own independent network?
That's an interesting question. I don't think, one, that we're entirely relying on outsiders coming in to build this stuff. Like, there is an existing dev team and existing community of contributors that's here already and wants to build on this, as we've seen. But otherwise, for new network builders, I would say that the big thing they get is they get a large established community. They get the benefits of data credits being usable across multiple networks, which I think is pretty useful for the end customers, and therefore provide some cross-selling benefits within the DAO. And I think the kind of business model in a box idea, where you need to define these specific attributes of your subDAO or your network, and as long as you can build it, you're off to the races. So it just helps, building. It helps building these networks on rails, where you kind of have guidelines and you know what to do, and you can go and push along that if you can technically deliver, which I think is really helpful for especially some very deeply technical founders who may not know what else to do.
And I think a lot of the value add and revenue potential for all of these protocols or use cases, depending on how we sort of think about subDAOs, they rely on an immense amount of sort of marketing, sales, and business development with established companies, established players that like as somebody that's run their own business, like at the end of the day, product is important, but distribution, sales, marketing, BD is the difference between a good idea that doesn't go anywhere and a good idea that, can become market defining. And being able to sort of cross leverage those relationships, I think is really important. And if Helium as an organization, or not organization, as a network develops a sort of positive cachet, a positive reputation, it's a lot easier for that new network to onboard clients because they're not, working with, 15 different groups and working with a whole bunch of different relatively small groups. They have confidence in sort of the macro network that is behind these protocols. And, I think especially for what we're doing, it's so reliant on those large scale relationships in the long run, especially with 5G and things like that, that is not really given enough weight in the community, in my opinion, of how important that is. So yeah, I think it's really important that these companies want to work with truly established groups rather than working with a whole bunch of small groups.
I think that's something I learned on our panel last week, is that there is an amazing network effect that can be built between the projects in the Helium ecosystem and the people who want to do mining, whether that's Wi-Fi, 5G, LoRa, CDN, VPN. All these people are interested in participating in these decentralized networks, and Helium kind of creates a central location, not centralized, but a central location for everyone who's interested in that type of stuff to benefit from one another's knowledge and projects, basically. All right, this next question is a two-parter. I think we already asked the first part. The first part is, what does a network of networks even mean? So I think we covered that well in describing the HIPs without using the language of crypto or finance. But the second part is, does this affect what the purpose of the network was from the get-go? Do these changes affect what the purpose of the network was from the get-go?
I guess I'll try that one. I don't think so. If I think back to like what Helium as a company originally started out to do, it was certainly very IoT centric, right? Like we always viewed that as the sort of biggest gap in the market, and I still think that was right. But as we moved into building the network and the sort of crypto side of things, I think it became, clear to us, or at least clear to me, that what we were building was sort of a template that you could use for lots of other things, assuming that it worked, right? Like at the start, there were a lot of questions around whether this model would even work, and, would people participate in a network like this? And, we're not the first to have attempted to build a community run network, but by any means. And so there were a lot of questions around that. But I think as those started to get answered, it became fairly obvious that what we had was sort of a blueprint for building decentralized networks that really could be of any kind, but particularly wireless networks. So at least in my head, that was always part of the thinking, right? That we would never really just stop at IoT. How you would get to the other types of networks was always a big question mark, right? Like back in 2018 or 2017, when we started work on this, CBRS wasn't really a thing, for example. Like Magma didn't exist, so the pieces around like how you would actually go to market or how you would actually build this technology solution for something like cellular was completely unknown. But the idea that it could be done was definitely something that we had in our heads, and things like Wi-Fi were sort of the next obvious target. So I think the availability of CBRS, which is the unlicensed spectrum in the United States that we can run a cellular network in that is supported by like iPhones and Android devices, and the availability of something like Magma, which is the open source protocol stack that's used in the Freedom Fi devices. Like I think those things like meaningfully changed the ability for us to actually build something like this. And so you have to be a little bit adaptive, like I've sometimes seen the commentary that like, why wasn't this all planned from the start? And that's part of the answer, right? Is that the landscape changes very, very quickly, and it's difficult to plan. I saw I think it was Anatoly from Solana say that like anything more than a 6-week roadmap in crypto is just a waste of time. And it's sort of true, right? Like everything changes really, really quickly. And I think you've got to be able to like adapt and react. And, several months ago, I went to Tushar and the Multicoin team, and I said, like, I think we're going to need some kind of separate token governance structure for each network because cellular won't be the last one. And HIP-51 is what everyone came back with, which I think is fantastic. So some of it certainly planned, some of it just sort of reacting to the availability of new technologies and regulatory changes like CBRS. And I think we always have to be able to be reactive like that. We can't plan too far ahead because we just don't know.
And so, Amir, do you think this new design is essentially taking the network to its logical conclusion? Whereas if it were more limited, maybe someone else would have taken the same model and built sort of a generic version of it. So if that's inevitable, why not just build the generic version as the next version?
I'm not sure I understand the question. You guys said it differently.
Sure. So there's this economic model of Helium, right? Where you have HNT and you have data credits, and sort of the realization behind HIP-51 is that that's applicable to a lot more than just these two wireless networks. So as part of the thinking to go to this generic model, because, you know, this is what, now that this economic structure has been uncovered, like this is what is sort of the natural end state, is for it to be an open landscape where anyone can come in and participate in this type of economic model?
Yeah, I certainly think so. And that was sort of the realization for me, right? Was that as we were thinking about 5G and cellular and like how that was all going to work, it sort of became obvious that we couldn't one off the solution for cellular, right? Because there was going to be inevitably like another thing, right? And whether it was Wi-Fi or whether it was, you know, a decentralized VPN or a decentralized CDN, or whether it's, you know, Wi-Fi 7 or 6G, or, you know, there was always going to be something, right, that followed. And so rather than try and create sort of a one-off solution for 5G where we split HNT in half or something like that, it sort of became obvious to me that we should have a better structure than that allows the network to expand beyond just, you know, two hand-picked protocols, because in the end, you know, Helium really could encompass anything that involves a distributed network of nodes. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing with like the boring protocol guys. And, you know, we've talked to a handful of decentralized CDN providers, for example, which I think is also a really interesting application. And so those are to me like exemplars of the fact that this actually does make sense, right? That there are lots of different use cases where a distributed network of nodes are needed. IoT was the start, cellular will be the second, and then, you know, who knows what comes after that.
That's a great lead into the next question, which is, what is the relationship between all of the tokens? What is the value of HNT if I'll be mining network tokens instead?
You can, I guess, jump in here a little bit. What is key to making all of this work is that the purchasing of data, regardless of what the protocol, regardless of what the use case is, has to happen in terms of data credits, which can only be created via the burn of HNT. And so while you might be earning this L2 token or whatever, I guess we don't call it L2 anymore, but this subDAO specific token that is convertible into HNT, every subDAO sort of follows that same funnel. So HNT is really capturing the data value of all of the networks, because you can't bypass that step when going to data purchases. So it actually does nothing to the BME, you know, token economics model of HNT as it sits today. It's effectively unchanged. You're just, you know, I don't foresee a lot of token earners necessarily also being the large scale purchasers of data. I think, you know, in my opinion, that's going to be sort of large scale, you know, traditional companies and things like that in the long run. So yes, you can convert from the, you know, subDAO to the HNT to DC, you know, ideally in a somewhat automatic way if you need to. But, you know, most groups that interact with the payment side of buying data will still need to go through sort of the DC channel. They won't see any of that. They won't see the burning of HNT to DC necessarily, but they still need to interact with that sort of base chain of HNT and DC. So it all sort of funnels back to that, regardless of what the subDAO is.
Yeah, to chime in there and explain it slightly differently, I see the tokens being split in terms of their role, right? HNT serves the role of being the primary economic flywheel of the whole ecosystem. It's the economic engine that drives everything. And so what James is saying is, entirely correct around the data credit burn, and the burn and mint equilibrium remains undisturbed. But these new subDAO tokens are essential for the governance and the management of each of the networks, whether that's LoRaWAN, 5G, Wi-Fi, CDN, VPN, all these things that, all these networks that we're talking about. And that has some utility. It has some governance power. If you see in the HIP 52 proposal, we put in a mechanism by which staking that LoRaWAN token actually increases the number of challenges that a hotspot can participate in. So subDAOs have the ability to include their governance token and interesting mechanics like that as well. But HNT remains the primary economic engine and the reserve currency for all the subDAOs.
And then a follow-up to that is, does all value accrue to the DNTs? Is there any reason to still hold HNT? I think James answered the latter part, but the first part.
Yeah, I think the way to look at the automatic conversion is that it creates a floor really for the value of the DNT token. So if, HNT is at $100 and it's a 1 to 10 automatic conversion rate, you're really saying, okay, well, the DNT has a value of about 1/10 of an HNT, as far as the automatic sort of liquidity protocol goes. But it doesn't mean that the market can't value that differently. So let's say that there's one protocol that the market says, okay, this is going to be massive. This is going to be really hot. I expect a lot of value to sort of go to that subDAO via, HNT going into its reserve over time. Therefore, we're sort of forward pricing that subDAO token. So the conversion rate is really little more than a floor for that pricing. The tokens can and often should have more value than the HNT, or the subDAOs as a whole should have more value than the HNT specifically, and its reserve. You might look at that as like its book value versus its market value. So I do think a lot of the value ends up getting accrued to the subDAOs, and one of the things that we also did was having sort of that one-way conversion from subDAO tokens to the main HNT conversion. You can't go from HNT to subDAO token. Means that the only people that are initially getting deployed, the DNTs, are people that are mining that for that subDAO, providing value for that subDAO. So it's really up to them and gives them the value of that subDAO and gives them the option of, do I hold this as a subDAO token? Do I automatically convert it, or do I go to the market and sell it at market rate, which could and very possibly will be higher than the conversion rate.
Yeah, to chime in here, I would say the short answer to that question is no. This does not mean that the DNTs capture all the value and HNT no longer captures value. That is not correct, because you do need to burn HNT to come up with data credits. It's the only way you can do that. And if you want to transfer data through any of the subDAOs, you have to pay with data credits. So the same burn and mint equilibrium is still there. The same value capture mechanism for HNT is still there. That's not changing. The incremental utility that is provided by the subDAO tokens, the DNTs, should also capture incremental value. So our hope is that this proposal creates value or unlocks value through enabling more efficient coordination and, kind of unbundling the role that HNT was serving, where previously it was governing everything. And everything was consolidated. Here, by having more specialization, I think we end up with more value overall.
Yeah, I guess I answered that sort of backwards, but you're right that there's value sort of going to both places. I would look at owning HNT as maybe, this is not a one-to-one comp, but like owning an index versus making a more focused investment on, you know, a company within that index or a sector within that index that you think, you know, may or may not, you know, accrue a little bit more value than the index as a whole. But they both, you know, the index still gains value from those sectors, you know, overperforming the entire index, whatever it is.
And if a lot of value accrues to the DNT, from my understanding, it seems like a lot of HNT will be locked up in those treasuries if people are not redeeming the DNTs for HNT at as much of a high rate as would be expected. So that will essentially mean that the circulating supply of HNT will be reduced.
Or not increasing might be another way to look.
Right, not increasing.
I just want to say, if there's a ton of demand for a DNT, like that is great for HNT and for Helium, because that incentivizes the build out of that network. And, you know, that's letting the market have a voice, and the market saying, hey, we think this network is really important. And we think this is going to be valuable. So we want to incentivize more investment here. And so enabling the market to do that, I think is very powerful.
Agreed. All right. This next question is a two-parter. So I'll ask the first part first. Do you need to lock up vhnt into a DNP for any amount of time, or can it be moved between DNPs each epoch?
My intention in the current proposal is that it can be moved. The vhnt is locked up, so you can't turn it back into HNT without going through the lockup period or the cooldown period. You know, the way that these V tokens usually work is they are, there's like an unstaking period that you select. And based on the unstaking period that you select, the multiplier is larger or smaller. And you can change your vote, right? So if you were staking your vhnt towards one subDAO, you can change it and stake it to another without having to wait for the whole lockup to end. But if you wanted to turn it back into regular HNT so that you could trade it or transfer it, then you would need to wait for the lockup to end.
Okay, great. And then the second part is a question that I also have personally, which is, what happens to the vhnt that's delegated to a DNP when it's time to vote? Do I need to undelegate that vhnt for the voting epoch, or can I vote with delegated vhnt?
To defer to the devs on the implementation of this, but intention is you should be able to vote with delegated vhnt.
I think that's only fair, right? Like if you're delegating your vhnt, you should always be able to vote with that. I think the sort of the reason why applying vote escrow tokens to a particular sub network, like why that's interesting is really to signal interest in that sub network. And like voting on governance, I think is sort of a separate action, right? And I think you should be allowed to do either. And I think the implementation should reflect that. Sorry, either or both, to be precise.
Great. So the next question is a bit of a repeat, but I'd like if someone on the panel could maybe answer this in a very sort of short and summarized way, just because I think that for some people who are approaching this for the first time, I think hearing this explained from different angles could be really helpful to them. So the question is, will 5G be using a different token, and can it be tied to HNT somehow?
I could take that one. Yes, the 5G subDAO will have a different token, and it is connected back to HNT through the programmatic treasury. I think actually Max said something kind of interesting in the channel just now, which I think is really good, which is sort of like 5G token is sort of a right to redeem your HNT from that treasury if you ever choose to, or it's a token that you can use to lock up and govern the subnetwork that you have.
Great. I think that's a good answer. Next question is, what is the value proposition for a DNP to join Helium instead of going on its own that offsets the negative effect of HST rent seeking? HST is effectively a tax on DNPs that they can avoid by going independent. I don't think that last part was a question, more of a statement.
I think we sort of covered this in the earlier question about the value to a new DMP, being part of the Helium network. But, again, it's just creating the technology and or the network has a ton of value only when it's in conjunction with being able to monetize that, and being able to work under the umbrella of a highly established network like Helium provides a ton of value and likely, accelerates the time to being able to monetize that either use case or protocol. I think that's an unbelievable amount of value. Like if once we get this 5G, hopefully POC out the ground and all that, I think that the demand for those units will be in far excess of what it would be if it was just a separate network starting from scratch. And the demand for the bandwidth provided by those units will be in far excess compared to if the network was sort of created separately and on its own. So there's a massive amount of value of just being able to leverage the community and leverage the existing sort of reputation of the Helium network as a whole.
Yeah, to chime in here, like the network is valuable because there are people who are writing the code to like make this possible, who are building it. And so like that costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of resources to put it all together. And so in order to do that, there needs to be some incentive. We have to pay the devs. We have to pay the business development and marketing, and like the people need to be compensated for working. And so to call HST rent seeking is basically saying that people should work for free, which is just something that, as a capitalist, I don't believe in.
Yeah, I think there's been some confusion around HST and exactly what it is. If we could float on that for just like one more minute, maybe. HST is basically a security token where part of the HNT emissions go to the people who initially funded the network and built the network. And Amir, I've seen you comment on this in public channels before defending HST. I personally understand the value of HST. What would you say, Amir, to people who say that, HST is rent seeking or HST is something that we could just vote away?
And I think it's, of course, I'm biased here, but I think it's incredibly naive, right? These networks take years and tens of millions of dollars to build in highly, highly risky environments. And if there isn't a reward for those investors and those teams that build these networks, then no one would ever build the networks, right? And so I think the HST approach that we took, in my mind, is one of the most fair distributions to the team and investors that I've seen. Lots of current large scale projects out there have taken a sort of pre-mine approach, and you could argue whether pre-mine is better than HST, but HST is sort of like a locked up pre-mine. It's, like a 50-year lockup basically on tokens. I don't think the percentage is unreasonable. I think it ends up being 20 something percent of the circulating supply when it's done. And there's, projects out there with 50% plus going to the team and investors as part of a pre-mine. So to me, it's like I said, you could never build this without some structure like it. So it's kind of a moot point to keep discussing it. It would never have been built. We would never have been funded. We would have gone out of business. None of this would exist. And I think everyone sort of has to be cognizant of the fact that this took years to build and was a very high risk proposition. Like in hindsight now, it looks easy and everyone's like, well, I wish I could have invested. But at the time you wouldn't have, because it was, there was so many unknowns and it was unclear if we would make it a lot of the time. So, and I'm very thankful to the investors and the team, including Tushar and others that sort of backed us on this journey, because it was non-obvious. And at the time the Helium crypto network was starting, I think we were in one of the worst crypto winter environments And so to bet on Helium or any of the projects at that time was very risky and very contrarian. So it's important that everyone bears that in mind. It looks easy in hindsight, but at the time, it definitely wasn't.
All right, great. The next question is, HIP52 introduces the concept of staking VHLT for or against individual hotspots. How will hotspots be convicted of gaming proof of coverage?
Tushar, do you want to start this and I'll pick it up?
Sure. So what we were thinking here with this mechanism was, how can we decentralize this process around the block list and identifying people who are cheating or spoofing on the network. So we came up with this mechanism where you can stake towards or against a certain hotspot. You can stake towards a hotspot to get some of its earnings if you think it's going to be a particularly well-earning hotspot. The incentive here is really for people to stake to their own hotspots is going to be the most likely outcome to boost their earnings, which I think can be a very powerful thing. And it also helps the network understand, because there is signaling value to that stake. And so it helps the network understand, where there might be value. And the inverse is also true, where staking against a hotspot means that you think it is doing something to harm the network. You think, it should get rewarded less. And you're actively, signaling that with your tokens. And so that will draw the attention of, the committee at the Helium Foundation that works on the deny list or the block list. And it will also, have this linear effect on the number of challenges that a hotspot has. So I think this is a really good way to decentralize this process and allow the community to signal.
That's right. And really this is, as the network grows, the number of hotspots that'll be out there will grow, parabolically. And that's what we want to happen. And we don't want, but the size of the team that's going to be focused on this is going to be really, really tactical. I think what will be interesting here is that, providing data, like additional data or where attention should be paid, I think will be useful. Also, the other thing that I think that's interesting around the sort of being able to vote for or stake for a hotspot that's in a particularly sort of novel coverage area. I think that's super interesting. I think there have been some concerns, or are we incentivizing enough of the edges of cities or sort of new agricultural areas that are truly providing novel coverage? Are we doing enough there? I think this is an opportunity to look to really vote with an asset and sort of enhance challenge rate in an area. And that's sort of the other side of this that I think is really interesting.
This is going to be a really interesting change to see play out.
Yeah, and I really encourage the community to read HIP52 in its current form. I think it sort of goes into detail around this. There's a question in the chat around does it help the hotspot earn more? It's definitely addressed in there.
Okay, this next question, I don't quite understand it, but I'm just going to read it as is, and if it makes sense to any of you, go for it. In HIP53, when addressing the bonding curve and the P equals S to the K times 1.1, I believe, and the subsequent integral, it's unclear when MNT is being used and HNT is being used. Would love some clarification. Thanks.
All right. I'll go this time. So one thing is HIP53 is being updated today. So please give us a little bit of time to update it. Some of these bonding curves were definitely good for people that think in math terms, like me and Cheyenne and others, but terrible for literally every other human in the world. First of all, we definitely did some work to sort of improve that and sort of reduce the complexity there. And so I think definitely worth looking at it. I think HIP51 gives a good overview of what each programmatic treasury kind of looks at. The fraction is simpler. The idea is that there's a total supply of the subnetwork token divided by the amount of HNT that's in the treasury, right? That's the redemption price, at least at the at the core contract. And then, as James mentioned earlier, there's a potential float price if there are other markets out there. Go ahead, Tushar.
Yeah, I would just echo that. That question becomes no longer relevant with the updated version of HIP 53, which discards that formula.
Well, that's about as clear as you can get. All right, this next question is a bit of a heavy hitter. Is there a contingency plan if these HIPs do not pass?
We keep building the LoRaWAN network, right? I mean, that's a signal that the community is telling us if that's the case.
Yeah. So I want to ask, why they didn't pass? I don't think a vote would fail without a lot of reasons being provided and community discussion around it. So I think the context qualitatively would also be really critical. Is it just, we want to rework these elements? In which case we'd go back to rework them according to community feedback, or is it something else?
Yeah, I guess maybe an assumption in this question that might not be correct is that there is one vote, and if they don't pass, it's done. I think it's more complicated than that, right? There's a chance for revision and doing another vote, maybe even multiple votes, until there's a version of this move forward plan that the community is okay with.
Yeah, I look at not entirely, but major aspects of this sort of sprouted from the original sort of idea behind HIP 37 of what back then we used to call Omni Protocol, sort of POC rewards and things like that. And how do you reward, new protocols coming onto the network? And, I think we've taken it a long way and in a positive way since then, but, that basic idea can go many different directions. I think we have a really good implementation. There might be some improvements around the edges, but I think we have a really good implementation here with HIP 51 to HIP 53. But, as these guys have sort of commented on, it's not like, we can't try something. We can't continue to iterate and can't continue to improve. I think we'll want to get this HIP to a point of pretty solid community support before it goes to vote, because it is such a major sort of change to the network. But I think we're in a pretty solid space or spot right now.
Yeah, it might be worth it's only been a couple of months since the first version of this thing came out. But if you look at the first version versus today's version, it's sort of an enormous change. And that was intentional, right? Like it is important to build and talk about these things in the public eye, get feedback, iterate on it, and really build something that the community really can get behind.
Yeah, I think that's something to recognize, is that we're in a new stage of Helium where it's not like there's this Helium Inc. company and whatever comes out of it comes out. They're issuing the chain vars and whatever happens, happens. It's very quickly shifted towards build in the open, get public feedback, test things out weeks or months before they need to actually be voted on and implemented, which I think is a more decentralized and better version of Helium. But I think maybe some people aren't aware that that shift has occurred. All right, we've got one more question from the forum. So I'd like to invite now anyone who wants to ask voice questions to the panel. Please raise your hands. Again, this is being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, please don't ask a voice question. But otherwise, you can also type a question in the AMA questions channel, and I will start taking voice questions. I will start inviting people to ask voice questions after this next question. So the final question from the forum is, are these DAOs going to be DAO LLCs registered in Wyoming? What are the legal implications of that type of entity structure? And will any of the new subDAOs have to adhere to any specific entity structure to be accepted as a subDAO?
It's a good question. So I'll chime in here. I think the use of the phrase DAO and subDAO is more descriptive than it is meant to be a legal term. This is, we're thinking more from a technology perspective. The reality is these things are all networks that are connected by code. And there's no plans to, incorporate entities for this. We have the Helium Foundation, which is the nonprofit foundation that helps manage and coordinate the community for the entire Helium network. And I think, that's like the coordination entity, but not expecting these subDAOs to be legal entities, expecting that these are networks that are connected by code.
Yep, definitely a bit of a legal gray area there. Alrighty, let's take some voice questions. We got John Mac 50 and Lodrag. Welcome to the stage. John, since I said your name first, why don't you go first?
All right, thank you. So first, huge thanks to the Helium team. You guys are incredible, and doing the unprecedented. Really, really appreciate everything you guys are doing. So, quick question regarding the new tokens that are going to be generated. What kind of smart contract functionality does the team intend to implement? So, for example, like with halvings and things like that that we currently have with the vhnt smart contract. So, what kind of similar or different functionalities does the team plan to implement on a smart contract level?
I think it depends on sort of as I answered in the other question. Like I think the starting version of, at least what I would like the starting version of HIP 51 and 2 and 3 to be, is fairly simple and on the current chain, just so that we can actually get started and, particularly begin, mining and earning for the 5G network. So most likely it will look very similar to the way it looks today, where there isn't an expressive, smart contract environment or anything like that. These are just sort of hard-coded transaction types. I do think it probably makes sense to evaluate other L1 alternatives. And obviously there's a lot of them out there, and they all have various pros and cons. And so I think a little bit of the answer depends on where we end up in that stage, right? But I think for now, the focus is like, how do we enable the programmatic treasury? How do we enable the protocol score? How do we issue the 2 new tokens? And how do we get mining really started for the cellular network? To me are the most important sort of immediate steps. And then I think some of the rest of the questions can be answered later, depending on what the technology stack looks like. Like if we end up using Cosmos, it will be one set of things. If we ended up on Solana, there would be a different set of options there. Or if we ended up on Avalanche or like whatever other chain. So I think there's a lot to figure out over time, but the priority, I think, in my opinion, at least, should just be to get on with it and figure out how to get the 2 new tokens started.
Yeah, and to provide a little more color there, the current chain is not a smart contract chain. It is, each one of the transaction types have an explicit action on the ledger, and that's sort of what we're thinking about with, kind of an early implementation of this. It would just be, 2 new ledgers, right, for these 2 new balances, and then the sort of rules around the consensus rules that sort of drive the programmatic treasury and the redemption contract and things like that.
Alrighty, thank you, John, for the question. Lodrag, you're up.
Hey, man, thanks. Appreciate it, guys. What was coming to my head I'm still trying to grab my head around how it's going to work. But I was wondering if you could describe to the room if you guys have any in-depth thinking on it, any vulnerabilities that somebody could exploit in this. And the reason that I asked that is because if you are able to dedicate vhnt to a project, couldn't somebody submit a lot to a project to generate?
I think you got cut off there, but I think you're asking, can someone submit or delegate a lot of vhnt to a project to maybe increase its share of HNT going to the treasury?
I can take a stab at the question, or at least the portions of it that I heard, which is, yes, the intention is that HNT owners can stake towards a subDAO to signal value for that subDAO. We did some modeling around this to understand the possible threat vectors, and the threat vectors here are the same as they are of any proof of stake network, right? If someone controls too much of the stake, then they can do some weird things, but also they're not incentivized to. So, anyone who is staking a large amount of vhnt to any subDAO is locked into that HNT for a long period of time, right? And the reason why the lockups are so long is to make sure that people can't borrow HNT to then go and, play any games with the protocol score or other mechanisms. So that's one of the most important safety features of this proposal, is that vhnt starts with a minimum of like a 6-month lockup, right? Or, whatever the number of blocks is. And so because of that, you can't borrow to go and manipulate scores or do anything like that. You are locked into the outcomes for the network over that period of time. And so it's really not in your incentive to go and stake all that capital, put all that capital at risk for a long period of time to then go do something malicious, which would then hurt your ownership.
So I think there will be some return seeking as far as vhnt rewards coming from the subDAO, where if there's outsized amount of vhnt dedicated to a specific subDAO, it's actually sort of behooves people to put their vhnt into other subDAOs, that the ratio between vhnt and the other components of protocol score are at more of an equilibrium, or there's a lack of vhnt compared to the rest of the protocol score. You have to sort of work through the math, but you can think of each part of the protocol score as a multiplier, and let's say vhnt has a multiplier of 2 and the rest of it has a multiplier of 3, and then all of a sudden that first multiplier goes up to 100, and the second part of the equation stays at 3. The rewards per vhnt don't really increase, versus, let's say, another subDAO has the non-vhnt part of the protocol score equals 6 or 10. There'll be more rewards per vhnt dedicated to that compared to the protocol that has sort of this outweighted amount of vhnt. So as long as there is some sort of free market forces that drive vhnt towards sort of an ROI as far as distributions go, I think the market will sort of handle vhnt to a certain degree. If it was a pure return-seeking market and nobody was dedicating vhnt specifically to boost a protocol, vhnt should sort of be a non-factor in the equation. It's the other factors that will sort of drive which of the protocols get vhnt. I don't know if any of that made sense, but if you need help looking at the math, just let me know.
It made sense to me. That was a good way to think about it. I haven't thought about it that way.
So Low Drag followed up in AMA questions because their audio isn't working. And the question is, so what if someone wants to kill a competitor by stealing rewards via staking more vhnt?
Again, I think the free market will drive vhnt to the protocols that are creating value via the other components of the protocol score. So, there's very few actors in this market that have individually a material enough amount of HNT that the larger market couldn't, sort of move in another direction and negate what they're trying to do.
And as stated in HIP 51, vhnt is non-transferable. So whichever layer 1 solution we end up at is going to have to support that non-transferability, where it's locked into the wallet from which the HNT was originally staked.
All of the major smart contract platforms support this type of functionality. Like, this is live on Solana today, is live on Ethereum today. This is not a weird thing. The key difference, the key thing here is, like, when you lock up your HNT, do you get a token back, or is it just like a voucher in a contract? There's just a technical difference there. If it's a voucher in the contract, you don't have any tokens to transfer. There's a lot more nuances that I should probably let Abhay or Amir comment on this, but I think it's definitely possible because I've seen it.
Yeah, it's possible. We just have to write it, or that's it is the pattern has been kind of written and the sort of trail has been blazed before, right? Like the Curve tokens and the Tribeca tokens are kind of known. in other chains. And so I think that's we're not inventing anything like super new here.
Yeah, and I guess whatever is created will probably be optimized for functionality and also taxes, because things get kind of unfavorable when you start swapping tokens for other tokens.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of not having on-chain tokens where you don't need on-chain tokens, because exactly that it's one thing to have staked tokens that aren't really changing form factors versus, you're getting this type of token and you're losing this other type of token, and you're getting this other type of token on top of that. Granted, the vhnt, because of the non-transferability, should be valueless at the end of the day. So I'm not sure it really applies, but there's no real way to assign value to that, because outside of the value of what it provides you as a voting mechanism, because there's no way to sell it or anything like that.
All right, digging a little bit into the AMA questions channels, Max asked a little while ago, what steps will be taken to ensure that if we move to another chain, that choice is made because that new L1 is the best option for Helium and not because it's influenced by any other investments made in other chains?
This question sounds like Multicoin's invested in Solana. How do we make sure we don't pick Solana? But I think the real answer here is that we need to do a little bit more of a evaluation. Like, obviously at the time when we started Helium, there wasn't a whole lot around. Like, I think we started work in 17. So you could really only have used Ethereum, and that landscape has changed a lot over the years. The reason, again, that I'm advocating for the approach that I want to take, where, we just sort of start with the MVP version of a thing, is partially so that we have time to evaluate some of the other options. Like, there's so much out there now, and we've been so busy building and firefighting and everything that I don't think any of us here on the team are experts of any of the other options right now. So we've started to learn. We're in touch with a lot of the different L1 project teams, and I've been getting a lot of feedback and advice, and learning sort of the pros and cons of those chains. And so I don't know what the right scientific answer to that question is, other than I think we'll just, from an engineering point of view, want to make the decision that's the best decision to enable the functionality that we need. And we don't really care about much else, quite honestly.
Yeah, I think from an independent perspective, it's clear that there are multiple options here. It's not like Solana is the necessarily best fit or default option. I think Cosmos SDK clearly has things to offer. The modularity and the scalability has been proven with the Terra blockchain. I mean, RIP obviously, but that didn't die because the blockchain was bad. There were other things going on there. So yeah, I'm sure, I hope the team will evaluate all options and continue forward with whatever is the best fit, also that will help us get it done as fast as possible.
Sort of a side question from me to the more technical people here. The Cosmos SDK, you would still be building effectively your own L1 just using the SDK versus sort of building on top of a Solana or Ethereum or whatever it may be. Is that an accurate sort of representation of how the Cosmos SDK works?
Yeah, there's sort of two ways to integrate with Cosmos, and this might be getting way in the weeds here, but at a very high level, you can either build your own chain that uses Cosmos and Tendermint and sort of integrate very directly, or you can build your own sort of mechanism and use and implement IBC and then convince every one of those other sort of networks. Either there's it's a graph of networks, and so you have to convince all of that to support your bits of IBC. With Solana, it's more monolithic, and you sort of support, and everything sort of lives on a single chain, and that's by design. Ethereum has a bunch of layer 2s, all sort of have their own rules and their own sort of ways to settle to the layer 1. But these are all things that we're starting to look at, and as Amir said, we're just trying to spend, but we're trying to in a way get everything at the same time. Like, we want these tokens to exist, and we want the 5G network to grow today, right? And we already have a few folks that have put up 5G small cells. We know that there are plenty of others who are about to, and we want to make sure that network grows, sort of independently of the sort of large technical lift that it would take to consider another chain. So that's what we're trying to do both.
And then Max just wanted me to ask the follow-up to this, which is, on the flip side, will disclosures be made about partial ownership in any of these companies and projects applying to be new subDAOs before the Helium DAO vote to allow them to join? Will those owners be expected to recuse themselves from that vote?
Not exactly sure how to answer that question because I feel like it's loaded in a way. But like ultimately, like, you know, the votes happen on chain right now. And you can certainly see the wallets that are voting on our, you know, through a current mechanism that we have. And I know there are other proposals of voting that are out there. Yeah, I think that's like the sort of lightest answer I can provide. I don't know if James, Tushar.
Well, I was just going to say, I think like context is needed here, or like an example of what this, you know, company or organization that would gain a lot of value from being a DNP. I don't. Are they talking about sort of the L1 that it's built on? This question can just be sort of interpreted in many, many different ways. I'm not sure without context or an example. Or it's not necessarily answering it.
It's also a little bit tricky because you can't. A lot of this is going to be anonymous, right? Like if I buy a bunch of tokens in a like look at Boring Protocol for example, right? Like I'm not sure if there's a way to prove that someone owns a lot of BOP, for example, beforehand. Like I could have 10 million BOP for all anyone knows and just not tell you. And so I'm not. Although, you know, I see Elon Musk saying pretty straightforward conflict of interest question. It's kind of different in a sort of anonymous token world because there's not really a, you know, paper trail necessarily for some of these transactions. So in theory, I think it makes some sense. Like we should obviously be careful that that it's not too pay to play here. I suppose I'm just not sure how you would actually implement it, knowing that most of the ownership can be anonymous. But it's a reasonable question, I think.
So Paul M asks, how would running on someone else's L1 work with transaction fees? All these POC transactions are fee-free today. Who would pay the ETH, SOL, etc. fees?
I think we kind of answered it in the chat in real time, but I think optimally you would kind of roll things up, right? So today, if you thought about LoRaWAN, for example, and imagine that we were running on, you know, Solana just for a second, you would have all of the existing machinery there as the LoRaWAN subDAO that sort of exists today. So you wouldn't be writing every single transaction to the L1 chain. You would be doing most of it on the L2, and then you would be rolling up very few transactions into the L1, if that makes sense, right? So you just sort of capture the state of the subDAO periodically and update it on the L1. So that's like a simple way of thinking about it, right? So that you're not sending thousands of POC transactions per second or per block or whatever. You're actually doing most of that in the subDAO, and then you're sort of sending one state update to the L1, so to speak. That's one way to do it. It's sort of a simplified version of how like most L2, you know, roll-up solutions work on like Ethereum or something like that. So I think we'd look to do the same thing. Like we have sort of a skeleton prototype of how that system would work with LoRaWAN. So I think there's still some work to figure out there, but certainly on some of the chains, like Solana specifically, the fees are minimal. So I think if we combine both of those things, we should be fine.
Yeah, I get that. Like what we need to sort of provide to the L1 is context that's required for the utility score and for the emissions that need to happen for the L1, because we assume that all those all the tokens for each subnetwork is living on the L1's ledger, right? So, you know, a single roll-up transaction, kind of like our rewards transaction today, that lets us say, you know, mint this much. Today we say mint this much HNT at this account. Instead, it would be mint this much HLT at this other account. And so that's kind of what would roll up.
I agree with all of that. And, you know, I hope that the transaction fees are low, but we also included a mechanism in HIP 52, and there will be a similar mechanism in HIP 53, where some of the emissions of the subDAO tokens go to an operations fund, and that can be used to fund, you know, whatever low amount of transaction fees, amongst many other things. So it's a more flexible pool of capital that can be used to incentivize hotspot deployments in particular areas that make sense, or other purposes as well. But the primary use case could be to help pay the transaction fees.
As much of a Solana maxi as I am, that this discussion has me fantasizing about Cosmos and how seamless the voting module is in the Terra ecosystem, and how many different types of voting that there are. Seems to work really well. It's kind of pre-built.
Yeah, Cosmos is super cool, actually. And, I think just for clarity, like one of the things that we really want to try and accomplish with looking at an alternative L1 is that we get to participate in that ecosystem a little bit more, right? Like today, HNT very much on an island, right? Like if, for using an example, like for an exchange to integrate HNT is a ton of work, right? Because HNT is unique. It doesn't look like any other token. There are no wallets other than the ones that we build, and there are no, there's no DeFi ecosystem because, there's no DeFi ecosystem in Helium. And so I think that's a huge part of it. And the Cosmos design is actually really, really elegant, where you get to run your own chain, and it's sort of interconnected with other chains using this IBC protocol. So that might be a cool way to solve all of the problems at the same time. But still we have a lot of research, I think, to do there. We're relatively clueless on the Cosmos side, although we are now well connected in with the Cosmos team, and they're being helpful, sort of explaining how this all works, and we're talking to other project teams. So yeah, it's a really cool design. I actually really wasn't aware of how cool it was until I started looking at it recently.
Yeah, I just want to chime in. I am also a big fan of Cosmos. So excited to see what happens.
So next question is, for HIP 51 and 52, for current miners, what happens to current HNT holdings past this point? What will it take to turn future LoRaWAN earnings into the HNT we earn today?
I missed the question. I was reading the chat scroll back, which is starting to pick up.
He was just asking like how to convert the subDAO token into HNT, or be able to continue earning HNT. And you could use the automatic liquidity protocol to convert into HNT whenever you want. There's been discussions of giving people that option, so it's occurring automatically. I don't know what that will, whether that will make it to implementation on V1 or whatever, but you should always have the sort of one-to-one option of, converting back to HNT without any issues.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. Like, there will always be an on-chain mechanism for redeeming the subnetwork token for HNT that's available in the programmatic treasury. So that's a default. Certainly if other markets are available that's not on our chain, that's another place where you could sort of exchange a LoRaWAN token for a HNT or something like that, or for whatever else. Yeah, that'll be there. This idea of an kind of automatic earning of HNT was an idea that we put into the HIP. This would require this is kind of a user experience sort of feature, in my opinion, right? Like, there are folks that have been earning HNT for the last 2.5 years, almost 3 years. They might prefer to just continue to earn HNT. And so, if I don't know if it'll be in the V1, but it's definitely something that, you can we should at least make it very, very simple in the wallet to press a button and make, whatever you have into HNT. And in fact, we will do that. And also, if you have one of the subnetwork tokens and you're actually using the network and you want to burn into data credits, we should make that very, very simple for you to do that. And that is sort of a UX challenge that wallets should take on at the very least. And, we will certainly put that into the Helium wallet.
Elmo asks, 5G proof of coverage requires HIP 53 to pass. What's the plan if 51 through 53 don't pass? Do we have to wait until they do, or is there a workaround?
I think this goes back to the prior question around, like, why didn't it pass, right? And is there an iteration that we need to do to sort of bring the community to align towards the goal of 5G being possible on this network?
Yeah, I think also, look, there's some things that we could do in between here. Like, check out the Helium Go channel in this Discord. We're working on a game, basically, that will allow people to participate in 5G witnessing. And that could be considered, a type of POC reward that is built entirely off chain. And that could be taken farther than it currently is, which, it's not even developed yet, but it could go pretty far without any of these HIPs having been formalized or passed or implemented. I'm just going to throw this one in because I think maybe the question asker thinks it's controversial, but I don't know. I'm maybe it's not as controversial as they think. But elephant equals PCN ? Basically, is Pollen the elephant in the room?
The elephant in what context?
It's literally the entire question. It's not a quality question.
I don't know how to answer that one. What about Pollen? I'm just not sure what the question is. Like we've obviously announced the 5G stuff a long time ago before I think we had even heard of Pollen. So yeah, I'm not sure what's being asked here exactly.
Keith R says, I think the question is Pollen beating us at our own game?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think I've answered this one before to someone in the community. Like, I think it's cool to see the sort of space grow. And I use the example of, I don't think the L1 space would be as big if it were just Ethereum, for example, right? Like, I think having Solana and Avalanche and, Polkadot and I would have said Luna, but, like all of the other competitors in that space has made that universe bigger. So I don't think of it in that way. Like it's a massive opportunity in a massive space. And, I would be shocked if we were the only one. And I'd be shocked if Pollen was the only other one. I expect there to be like many, people sort of trying to do the same thing. And I've heard the Helium for, X like a whole bunch of times since I've been here in Palm Beach at this conference. And so, yeah, Pollen's not going to be the last group of people, trying to build decentralized wireless networks. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. And to tie it to this specific conversation, they're just a different point in development compared to Helium. I'm not putting any sort of judgment on that, like saying it's good or bad or anything like that. They just are. They're currently building in sort of a centralized fashion. And these HIPs are about how do we maximally decentralize this architecture that we have here? So simply different stages of development.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also say that this is market validation. It's competition is a good thing. We should want competition. It means that, other smart people also think this is a really good idea. So, I actually see this as a very positive thing. It is the decentralized wireless industry maturing. You don't have DeFi with one DeFi protocol. And so I agree with Amir on his L1 comment as well. We are growing the pie. And I think we need to keep our eyes aligned on the goal, which is to provide access and connectivity to everyone as quickly as possible. And so it's not a red ocean where we're competing against each other. We're growing outwards.
Yeah. And interestingly, now there's all this discussion in AMA questions about, let's have Pollen or other competitors join as subDAOs. I mean, there was a recent interview with the founder of Pollen where he said he'd like to work more closely with Helium. So I think if there is a lot of community will, it's not something that's entirely out of the question. But of course, there are a lot of fine grained details to this entire proposition that aren't really relevant to the discussion here.
Yeah, and there's, and there are others, like someone mentioned AirScale here. I'm actually not familiar with those guys, but I know at least one other attempt at building CBRS networks. And I actually think it's great because one of the challenges with CBRS today is that there isn't that much hardware yet because no one is deploying it at scale. So the costs are still relatively high. So as we've seen with, the Helium LoRa network, like that demand, like that created sort of an unprecedented demand for LoRa hardware. And I think in CBRS, like we need the same kind of pull in order to get, the supply chain moving there and to get the costs of the hardware down as much as possible. But yeah, no, I continue to think it's cool. Like I've spoken to Anthony about Pollen a number of times, and I like what they're doing, and I like as Tushar said, the validation behind the idea. It's like clearly the right way to do this, and like I said, I expect there to be many more coming down the pipeline.
I'm glad to hear all of that. This is kind of why I wanted to toss this question into the ring, is because I think it's almost like people think it's something we shouldn't talk about, or maybe it's something that's controversial or, is a taboo subject to bring up. But it's such a small industry. Everyone's talking to each other. No one's trying to like make enemies this early on when we haven't even definitively proven that, a scalable 5G decentralized wireless network can be built, right? So we're all sort of trying to prove that together, whether it's Pollen, whether it's Helium. Any effort towards that goal is positive for all of us.
For what it's worth, if you went into a Pollen Discord chat, you'd see a lot of the same faces that are here. There's a massive amount of overlap between the two projects. And I think, the long-term goal of at the community level is aligned. And I've been very public about how I think they can operate very synergistically and help each other in many, many ways, which, Amir has spoken about some of them, but I don't think we can even foresee some of the ways that, a group of decentralized wireless networks that are meaningful could help each other and help move the macro market in a way that benefits all projects.
All right. I want to invite anyone to throw in any more HIP 51 through HIP 53 questions you might have. This is the time, right? The authors are here. Voice questions, please raise your hands. If you have a written question, please type it in AMA questions.
Yeah, so GTelnet has one that I've seen asked before, which is a good one, which is there have been discussions on whether existing validators will be moved to L2 or remain on L1. What are the current thoughts on this, and how do we ensure that their investment in the greater Helium network does not get downgraded to just an investment in a single subDAO? So I think for step one, this is going to be moot, right? Like, I think we're going to have to keep the same infrastructure in place, which means the same validators and the same, overall structure, and just add 2 more tokens and the distribution using the protocol score into the mix. For the next step, I think it gets a little bit more complicated. My personal view is that we probably shouldn't force anyone to do anything, right? So if validators at the L1 went away, for example, because we moved to like a Solana, then I think we should collectively as a community figure out what to do with people that have staked with a certain expectation. If we move to Cosmos, for example, we would run our own validators again as a network. And so, presumably there's an easy migration path there for existing validators to those validators. So I think there's a lot of questions there that are some are technical in nature, like the ones I just mentioned. Like if you're on Solana as an L1, then you don't really have sort of L1 validators anymore. So that requires a different answer. And then if we end up using something like Cosmos, then we still do have L1 validators. So there are questions there. And I think we would want to try and figure out a migration path that made sense and sort of present it to the community, and perhaps even vote on it if that was if it was something that had a big economic impact like that. But I think, like I said, for now, just very focused on like how do we get to step one. Hopefully it was a good enough answer.
All right, Greg, but the G is silent. Okay, so your name is Re. Re asks, what kind of timeline can we expect on 51 to 53, voting, deployment, etc.? HIPs are great, but unless voted on, don't go anywhere.
So I think I can start the answer to this. So there's a couple of things, obviously these AMAs are kind of a user education step that's, I think, required. We have an enormous community. The audiences are very different, right? They're the people that are active on Discord versus the people that sort of come into Discord every few weeks versus the people that are only on Twitter or only on Reddit or only on, whatever. They only see things when it gets sent as a push notification in their wallet app, right? There's sort of all the different audiences. And one of the things that I think is important with such a fundamental change to our network, which is what this series of HIPs is proposing, is that we just need to have education out there. I would be sad if we didn't have a lot of voting participation, at least by pure by wallet count or by amount of vhnt that's being voted with. So, I want to make sure that we do the work to educate first. And so there'll be a couple of things I know coming from the foundation over the next couple of weeks to make sure that's being done before a vote's being called. But as Tushar said, HIP 51 at this point is sort of word complete, but not code complete. And I think that's sort of the first step here.
All right. Loadrag with another question, which is, would a Polkadot parachain auction be worth winning to put Helium on our model after? Just looking for a comparison with Cosmos, etc.
Yeah, I was about to answer this in chat. But I also mentioned earlier, like I don't know enough about parachains, to be honest, to like probably answer this fully intelligently. But so I think I would just need to do more research. I understand there's like a limited set of parachains. You need to win an auction to be considered. You could there's sort of two nets that are potential. There's a lot of technical detail there that we would need to understand.
Personally, I think it's a little crazy that Helium would need to compete to get onto a chain. Like, I think there's a lot of projects that would recognize that Helium brings a massive amount of value to them, and if anything, they should be sort of competing for Helium rather than Helium the other way around. But at the end of the day, if whatever makes the most technical sense, I think should win. But the whole parachain model bugs me a little bit. It's I've seen it sort of play out in one or two other chains, and it takes a long time, and it just feels like a dog and pony show a little bit to get approved for a parachain. And I think there's some cost to the chains to it, which all of that just bugs me a little bit. But I don't know if they're technically superior, maybe none of that matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is, our core team, core devs right now is a very small group, and we're obviously also prioritizing things like light hotspots, making sure that completes. This idea of building this thing on our layer one is a priority, and we want to sort of start the implementation, at least to understand what it looks like on our L1, and then sort of have that as an option for the community to get started on 5G mining, which I think is something that a lot of people in the community want.
All right. I'm not seeing really any questions related directly to HIP 51 to 53, and no one's raised their hand at this very moment. So if there are any other questions that anyone sees in the AMA questions channel that you'd like to answer, you can have the floor for that. Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up.
Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. I actually have to leave now also. But this was great.
Yeah,
Thank you, everyone. Guys, thank you all.
Thanks, Arman, for moderating.
Yeah, thanks, Arman. Really appreciate it. And all the mods for hopping in the chat channels.
Yes,
Yep,
you.
absolutely. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming today. I think this was really productive, and hopefully we answered a lot of questions that need to be answered. We're going to continue to do stuff like this. HIP 51 through 53 are complicated, and this community education is what is necessary for the votes to eventually pass and for us all to come to a place of mutual understanding in order to evaluate any revisions that might occur in the future. So if you are listening to this and you're deep on 51 to 53, please do whatever you can to educate the people around you who are active community members and are interested in voting on it. There's a lot to dig into. If you haven't dug in, please at least check out the HIPs. They can be intimidating, but the easiest way to get to a point of understanding is to just start. So thank you to everybody who joined. Y'all are great. Thanks for the good questions. Thanks to the panelists, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning into The Hotspot. If you love our content, don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And if you want to maximize your impact, leave your honest review on Apple Podcasts. Your support helps us reach more listeners and educate them about the Helium Network.